Okay, the book of Daniel. Here we go. Where is our nation headed? What will the future look like for Christians seeking to live faithfully in this world? And where can we prepare for living in a pagan culture? Welcome to the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel helps us in these questions that we have. Really, I think there may be no better book for us to study in these days than the book of Daniel. What's up, Coach?
You guys win?
No, we lost like 20-something to nothing.
Oh, no.
20?
It probably wasn't that bad. I
Yeah.
lost count to nothing.
Oh, man.
I lost count of nothing.
Yeah.
Oh, my
I know we
Lord.
didn't score. Piper did bounce it off the upright there.
Nice.
Didn't go in.
Nice. Well, maybe we'll encourage you now in Daniel. Very practical book for these days. James Montgomery Boyce said this, quote, Daniel gives the meaning of history more clearly than any other portion of the Bible, and what is more, it tells us how to live for God in ungodly times like our own. And just think about some of the context of this book. Daniel was taken from his home to live in a secular society. Daniel and his friends were under pressure to conform to society and its values. Boyce says this, his religion was tolerated, even respected, as long as he did not allow it to intrude into public life or rock the ship of state. That is our situation also. We can practice our religion so long as it is not in the schools, at work, or in any public place, end quote. And wow, how relevant to our lives the book of Daniel is. The world also seems to be winning, godless leaders ruling, and yet God tells Daniel that he is in control of all of this and will establish his kingdom over all. So, very relevant book for the days in which we live. What Revelation is to the New Testament, Daniel is to the Old Testament. There's a lot of parallels. Basically, how you're going to interpret, how you end up interpreting Daniel is really going to influence the way you interpret Revelation, and of course some other Old Testament books as well. So, very pivotal in getting this book right and seeing what it's teaching. Daniel's the author of this book. That's pretty obvious, but the way we know that is Daniel claims authorship in chapter 12, and Jesus speaks of Daniel's prophecy, what Daniel wrote, in Matthew 24 when he refers to Daniel. So, got confirmation there, both in the Old and the New. He writes around the 6th century BC, and really there's Daniel lives a long life. And the events of this book go from 605 BC, the first deportation to Babylon, until around 536 BC, and around chapter 10, verse 1. In the beginning, Daniel's a very young man as he's taken away into captivity in this first wave. He's the first one to go, he and a group of people are the first ones to go. And the book ends in chapters 10 to 12, and he's somewhere in his 80s. So quite a long span that he has, and he's faithful through it all. We're introduced to Daniel, and he's a young kid, and he's faithful. We leave Daniel, and he's faithful. And he just goes through so much. And what an example to us of running your race all the way to the end. Faithful to the end, persevering till the end. So this is a great book on how to persevere in your life till the end. Despite living in a culture that is, there's Babylon, the quintessential pagan culture. And Daniel's a politician, right? And which is incredible. He has a very high position that he's exalted to by God, and he faithfully serves there in a pagan culture, in a pagan nation, Gentile nation. Daniel is technically, in the Hebrew Scriptures, not a part of the prophets, although he's prophetic. He's in the writing section, but in our English Bibles it gets placed after Ezekiel and before the 12. So after tonight, Lord willing, we'll just have the 12 left, which is kind of a unit in of itself, and then we'll be done with the Old Testament. So, wow, praise the Lord. Daniel, like I said, and his friends are taken captive to Babylon. Judah is taken captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness to the covenant. And there's really those three deportations. The first in 605, Daniel's taken. 597, Ezekiel's taken. And then 586, the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah's taken, but not willingly. He's taken to Egypt and not to Babylon. So the outline of this book is interesting. The book is unique in this one feature, that it is bilingual. The book is written in two languages. It's written in Hebrew and it's written in Aramaic. And this is somewhat of a clue, I think, to the way the book breaks down. Chapter 1 is written in Hebrew. Chapters 2 to 7 are written in Aramaic. And then chapters 8 to 12 are written again in Hebrew. And what you find is the focus of those chapters, chapter 1 focuses upon Daniel and his friends as they're taken to Babylon. So focus on Israel, we might say, and they're being taken into captivity, and yet how they're faithful, nevertheless. Chapters 2 to 7 focus upon God's plan for Gentile nations. We might just call it the times of the Gentiles. That's a title Jesus uses in Luke's gospel. So 2 to 7 focus on the times of the Gentiles, and you have in chapter 2 this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has of this statue, and it's talking about world kingdoms, world empires, and how they follow successively, leading to Messiah's kingdom. Chapter 7, the end of this middle section, also talks about 4 beasts that come out of the sea, and they parallel the 4 parts of the statue. They're talking about the same thing, and in chapter 2, there's a stone that crushes that statue. In chapter 7, the Son of Man is the one who's given dominion to rule over the world. So they actually parallel each other there. And then, of course, so the middle section is somewhat of a chiasm that has a matching parallelism. So then chapters 10 to 12 shifts back to a focus on Israel and God's future plans for Israel. So if you just think about it for a second, how would the language then play into that dynamic and just the themes that are going on there? Like, why would this middle section be in Aramaic practically based on what we know it's talking about? Any ideas? Like, if it's primarily talking about the times of the Gentiles.
To the Gentiles, to
Yeah.
the nations.
Yes, so they can understand it. Yeah, it's in there. It's in the lingua franca. It's in the vernacular, so to speak. It's in the language that they might understand. So you've got Hebrew. It's like the Hebrew sections focus primarily on Israel, and the Aramaic sections focus primarily on the Gentile nations. So another way to break it down is, not as close to like the structure itself, but just an observation, is that really you have half of the book is like stories, and the rest is prophecies. So chapters 1 to 6 focus on more stories, and then chapters 7 to 12 focus on visions. So that's not completely, it's kind of just like a rule of thumb, but obviously there's prophecy in the first part as well. You could really say chapter 1 focus on God's sovereignty over bringing Daniel to Babylon. In chapters 2 to 7, God's sovereignty over world Gentile kingdoms, empires. In chapters 8 to 12, God's sovereignty over Israel's future. Or you might say God's sovereignty over Israel's past, God's sovereignty over Gentile futures, and God's sovereignty over Israel's future. So that's kind of the breakdown. And obviously you can, in even that outline, hear that God's sovereignty is the main theme in this book. God's sovereign control of history. One writer, Keith Essex, says this: the sweep of human history during Gentile domination until the establishment, or the book shows us the sweep of human history during Gentile domination until the establishment of God's kingdom upon the earth is presented. So, God is showing his plan for all of history for kingdoms. It is one of the books that most clearly helps us to understand the dynamic that we mentioned this morning of the universal and the mediatorial kingdom. Because we'll see that there's an acknowledgement that God is the universal king over all by Nebuchadnezzar, and then there's this focus upon earthly human kingdoms and the inability of pagan Gentile empires to fulfill the kingdom mandate for God to have a representative human ruling on the earth, until you find chapter 7 that the one who can do that is the Son of Man. And that Son of Man language in chapter 7 is Jesus' favorite title for himself. Jesus really uses it exclusively for himself. And that comes from Daniel chapter 7. So, and it actually goes back, harkens back to Adam, who was given the first task to exercise dominion over the creation. So that's a huge part of Jesus' identity as he views himself even. So that's the flow of the book. So let's walk through this this book, chapter by chapter. Any questions there, just as we get started and set some of these things up? All right, chapter 1. Here we go. Buckle up. Here's God's sovereignty over Israel's past, we might say, or the present times for Israel as Daniel's taken. Chapter 1, Daniel begins this book, and look at just the first two verses. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, that's another name for Babylon, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So the book starts out in fearful days, and Israel's taken into captivity. And yet the book is going to focus on faithfulness in light of the future. I might put it this way, this is my attempt. In fearful days, we can remain faithful and fruitful in light of the future. In fearful days, we can remain faithful and fruitful in light of the future. In chapter 1, the main phrase to see how this passage breaks out is God gave. God gave. It comes up in verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And if you jump down to verse 9, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And then chapter 1, verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So you can see this recurring theme. Really, it's an idea of God's providence. We might say this speaks of God's sovereignty in providence. God's sovereignty in providence in chapter 1. And it really is a great breakdown for the passage. See God's sovereignty in suffering, as in verses 1 to 7. And they are brought into captivity. Now, what's fascinating about this is the first 2 verses. How relevant for today. Really, verse 1 is the human perspective. Verse 2 is the divine perspective. You might say it like this, that verse 1 are the headline news in Babylon. Israel falls, and it's the news that discourages. And then verse 2 is heavenly news. So there's 2 different, news agencies. There's the heavenly news, and then there's the headline news of the day. And so verse 1, in the 3rd year, the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So it's like, Nebuchadnezzar, he took them out. And then verse 2 is the heavenly news. It's the different perspective on the same event. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. So the idea is, who did it? Well, the Babylonian king did it. But who did it? God gave them. So you see God's sovereignty there, even in their suffering. And then you see this pressure immediately of assimilation. They're relocated, they're re-educated, and in the midst, and they're renamed as well. They're given new names, pagan names. They go to Babylon University, and all their education is there. And then they're brought to a new land. They're very young, and they're also given the royal treatment. They're just, they're the best of the best. These guys are educated to have a future role in Babylon's kingdom. And so there's an immense pressure on these young men. And then we might say, in the second gave, we see God's sovereignty in their steadfastness. They hold firm in verses 8 to 16. You see their character come out here, their courage, and they're together in this. Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who are given different names. And really, it's fascinating study. You could do this on your own time. Look up what their names mean. I mean, if they were all together, they could share the gospel together just by their names alone. I mean, it just walks through the gospel when they're all together. It's like, with our powers combined, we can share the gospel just by the meaning of their Hebrew names. But then they're changed into Babylonian names, which are pagan versions. But what's fascinating is these boys don't push back on any of these things. They don't push back when when they're relocated, when they're renamed, when they have to go to this school. But they do have a standard. They do have a line that they will not cross. And this food is the line, and so they refuse the food, but not in a brash way. Daniel makes an appeal, and he makes a very compelling appeal to the leader over them.
And I thought they were like 8 years old.
So yeah, it's interesting. There's different, reckonings of that. I've heard 8, I've heard 15. And so there's they're very young. So he very well may be around that old. I heard Chow say that recently, and so I got to look at that a little bit more because I had thought they were a little bit older than that, but he's way smarter than I am, so he's probably right.
So think about 8-year-old.
Yeah.
Finding a line to say.
Yeah.
This is. Yeah.
And so just for
the government.
Yeah. And so one of the things that shows, right, is that Daniel's family was really careful in instructing him. They were following Deuteronomy 6, teaching your children along the way and building into them. And we actually know around the time that Daniel is born, in the time of Josiah, he might be a descendant of Hezekiah. And so it's in this time of revival that he's born. And so he likely gets a really solid education for as long as he is in Israel until he's taken. And so what an example of what a young person can believe and know and do and have convictions about.
And there's no evidence in Daniel of his parents being alive or around.
We don't know about his parents, yeah. So
he could be, on his own.
Yeah. What's fascinating, too, is all the other boys we don't know about. We just know about these 4 because probably they're some of the few who really stood firm in this. So, yeah. Pretty amazing. So we see his sovereignty there in keeping them, holding them, and then also in their prosperity and their success. God is sovereign in that because after this test, they so they not only have the test, the food. It's not an example for the diet you should be on. This is like a supernatural thing that God is doing. So don't follow the Daniel diet or whatever.
Try it.
Yeah. So.
Had to be 8.
Yeah, I'm telling you.
So they have a final exam, essentially. They're examined by Nebuchadnezzar, and these boys are like the smartest out of them all. And it doesn't mean that God implanted them with a Neuralink chip and they were just super smart. No, they worked hard. They did the work, and God blessed that as well. So God's providentially at work too, in their suffering, in their steadfastness, and in their success. Verse 17 says, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chiefs of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So they have great learning, they become leaders, and Daniel's there for a long time. So he endures. So this is chapter 1. It's written in Hebrew, and it sets the stage here for these young men and how God is sovereign in his providence in their lives. Then we move into this middle section, chapters 2 to 7. And really it's the present and future times of the Gentiles, or God's sovereignty over the Gentile empires, written in Aramaic. So chapter 2, then we see God's sovereign plan. God has a plan for history, and that's unveiled here. Chapter 2 may be one of the most important chapters in the Bible for understanding the scope of history. Daniel's a great book for worldview. Sometimes the application of Scripture is just to give you a solid worldview of what God is doing in the world. And that's an example of this chapter here, that he's giving you the scope of history. It's a map of world history from Nebuchadnezzar to Christ's second coming. And what's fascinating is it doesn't come through a Hebrew prophet, but a pagan king, and not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic. The plans for the world, for world empires. What this chapter is here to tell us is that the God of Israel is the only God who can reveal the future because he determines the course of history. So first you have the dream and really the dilemma, because it seems that Nebuchadnezzar may not even remember his own dream. And depending on how you read this, I mean, he demands that they not only tell him the interpretation of his dream, but they actually tell him what his dream was. And they're like, these enchanters and stuff that he's got in his court, they're like, that's impossible. No, we can't do that. And he's like, well, you're going to die unless you can do it. So he threatens them, and they're all in this dilemma because they're all about to die, because not only can they not actually interpret the dream even if they're given it, but they can't tell him what his dream was out of whole cloth. Like, just, we don't know what was in your brain. So they're about to all die until Daniel steps in, and he's like, hey, can I have a shot at this thing? There's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he's not trying to take credit for himself, but he's pointing to the Lord. And so you have this whole, challenge, and what's going to happen to the interpreters? Well, Daniel gets an opportunity to speak to the king because he believes that his God will be able to reveal this to him. And we look at what Daniel says in verse 20. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. And so he doesn't take credit. Verse 27, Daniel answered the king and said, no wise man, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. So he's telling him, this is future. Your dream and the visions in your head as you lay in bed are these. So he's going to show him what his dream was. First, he tells him the dream. So there's the dilemma of the dream. But then that's verses 1 to 30. Then verses 31 to the end of the chapter, he then tells him, here's what your dream was. And then he goes back and says, here's what your dream means. And so what is the dream itself? Well, it's a dream of a statue. And the statue has a head of gold. It has arms that are of silver, and then it's got thighs. The chest and arms are silver. Its middle and thighs are of bronze, and its legs are iron, and then it has feet that are it's a mixture of iron and partly of clay. And so there's this big statue. It's got 5 aspects to it. But later we see, as he explains the dream, that there's really 4 kingdoms. So you got to remember this is really important. There's 5 aspects to the statue, and yet 4 kingdoms. So you've got Babylon is the head of gold, he tells Nebuchadnezzar. The chest and arms of silver are Medo-Persia, so this 2-part kingdom. The legs are Greece. The thighs, the legs are Rome, and so are the feet mixed with clay, except they're different kingdoms. So the 4th kingdom of Rome is actually a 2-parter. So the first part is the first iteration, we might say, of Rome, and then the feet, which is the 5th aspect of the thing, is a mixture of these two. And so this is like a revived Rome. It's a future Rome. And so if we're thinking about our perspective, we've seen a lot of these kingdoms come and go. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, we can read all about them. But this final form of Rome that he talks about has not even happened yet in our perspective. And so that's what's fascinating. I think some people get that wrong because they're like, well, there's four kingdoms, and they stop with Rome, but they fail to recognize that the statue actually has 5 parts to it, and that's because this last part it's like a revival of Rome in some way. It has aspects of it, but it's a mixture. That makes sense? Okay. Then there's another part to his dream, and look at what he says in verse 34. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So, we'll just run through this real quick, but Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, spiritual kingdoms or earthly kingdoms? They're earthly kingdoms, right? Real kingdoms. We read about them in history books. We can watch where their kingdoms, grew out from, and you can do the colors on the map. Oh, it got this big and that. The last kingdom, the stone cut out. It strikes these kingdoms. Spiritual kingdom, physical kingdom. What would you think? Well, some say, well, it's a spiritual kingdom. It's the spiritual kingdom of Christ. But if you're going to be consistent here, it is another physical kingdom. This is the physical mediatorial kingdom of the Messiah. It comes and strikes the stone, and it demolishes all the other kingdoms, and it fills the whole earth. And this is the earthly kingdom. So it becomes a great mountain. That actually connects with passages like Isaiah 2, elsewhere, which speaks about the geological changes that happen as Jerusalem is elevated up as this high mountain again. We talked about that in Ezekiel and the temple that'll be there. And so it becomes this great mountain. And so this is the vision, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has and is interpreted for him. Of course, you have other passages like Psalm 18 and 118 that speak about the stone. The stone was rejected, right? And so there's connection of the Messiah and the stone and other places. So you might put it like this. You have the fragility of earthly kingdoms of men, and then you have the firmness of the earthly kingdom of God. Here's a fascinating thing about this in the interpretation as he describes the different kingdoms. When he gets down to this last part of the kingdom, so verse 43, jump down there. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, verse 42, and as the toes of the feet, so now we're talking about the final form of this human kingdom, as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, and they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And so there's how many toes are usually on a body? 10, right? So that's actually important for later in the book because he's going to talk about these 10 different kings, really, and that's important. Just hold on to that. So there's these 10 toes, and then notice what it says in verse 44, and in the days of those kings. So what kings? Well, later in the book, he's going to tell us that there's 10 kings, and we've got 10 toes here. So I think what he's saying is in the days of these 10 kings, the 10 toes, in that form, the revived form of Rome, this is what will happen. So now we're talking about our future. So in the days of those kings, those 10 kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, its interpretation sure. So I think what's so significant about this is, to me, it locks in premillennialism as the proper eschatological position because it walks you through the major world empires. And then you have this final form of Rome, which we've never seen Rome like this before, by the way. There was never like this 10-king confederation. And so you've got that. In the days of those kings, whenever that kingdom comes, during that period, there will be the kingdom of Messiah that smashes that and establishes, and there will be there will be no kingdom that comes to overtake that kingdom, because Messiah's kingdom will be an eternal kingdom. So it locates the timing of the establishment of Messiah's kingdom in this latter time. So I think that's really compelling, not only that these are other earthly kingdoms, Messiah's kingdom is earthly, and you get the timing of that. So does that make sense? The logic of that? So very important to get the worldview from Nebuchadnezzar to the return of Christ, second coming. He's just giving you the sweep of history. So pretty amazing chapter that we see. It shapes our worldview. Okay, so then we move to chapter 3. And really, we could see this as God's sovereign presence. We saw God's sovereign providence, his sovereign plan, sovereign presence. And worship is key in this chapter. This can be seen in the repetition of the word 11 times, and 5 times it uses the word serve, like serving a deity. And I like what Dale Ralph Davis says about this chapter. He says, quote, "The story is first commandment material. The way is then clear, if costly, for God's people. The writer holds before you this episode because he wants you to make the same response as Daniel's friends. I will believe and obey the first commandment, even if it kills me. And it may." Love it. So what's amazing, so you don't miss the connection to chapter 2 with chapter 3. So Nebuchadnezzar has his dream. He needs Daniel to tell him it and then interpret it. Daniel does that. And he says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. You're Babylon. You're the beginning of these kingdoms. So what does Nebuchadnezzar do? Chapter 3, he makes a statue that's all gold of himself. So not just the head of gold, the whole thing is gold. He's like, okay, yeah, God, you got this plan for all these kingdoms and stuff, but I don't know about that. I don't like that kingdom, because it seems like I'm not going to be a part of all of it. So I'm just going to make this gold statue that's me, and I want everyone to, all the nations, and this is key. He wants all these different peoples to worship this statue and this pagan false religion, the folly of false worship. And so it's this image. It's an image that's set up and that he makes. And the entire government is in on this. It is government-mandated false worship. And so every tribe, nation, and tongue must bow down, verse 4. Everything is about him. So he takes it a little too far. And you might imply from it, it might be implied from this that he's trying to circumvent God's plan for history. God has this grand plan. He's like, no. It's going to be all about me. And so he tries to take the ultimate place. And so, because of that, Daniel is not present in this story, but his 3 friends are, and they refuse to worship. They're firm in their convictions. In fact, this is such an incredible statement that they make. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the old golden image that you have set up." God may or may not deliver us, but we're not worshiping this false image. We'll die if we have to. Well, what happens? Well, he gets upset, and he throws them into the fiery furnace. He has it heated up even more, and they're thrown in. But as they are in there, something incredible happens. They're not burned up. They don't even smell like smoke. They're walking around in the fire. And now there's a 4th in the fire, the 4th man in the fire. And it is the Lord Jesus himself appearing, fellowshipping with them. They're having a little, Bible study in there while Nebuchadnezzar's watching. And this is incredible as he rescues them. Then you see this incredible moment as they come out. Verse 29, "Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So God is with his people in suffering as they seek to faithfully follow him. So incredible. Chapter 4, we see God's his prerogative, we might say, God's sovereign prerogative, because this is such a great chapter. You see really the story of, one person put it like this, it's the story of two sovereigns. You've got Nebuchadnezzar and God. And it's interesting. The chapter begins with somewhat of a doxology from Nebuchadnezzar, from a saved sinner in verses 1 to 3, as he acknowledges God's prerogative and his power. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It sounds like one of Paul's letters, right? It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. So there's like this, it's like the beginning. You know how the story's going to end, because he's acknowledging God's sovereignty and his prerogative. But then verse 4 picks up, and you see his pride. And you see this incredible description of pride in verses 4 to 33. And essentially, he's walking around and he's looking at Babylon. He's like, oh, isn't this Babylon the great that I built? And he's just so enthralled with himself. And God humbles him. He's like, you're like this tree, and I'm going to chop you down. And really, he makes him go mad. He makes him go insane. And Nebuchadnezzar's out there eating grass in the field. And man, just think about the public relations mess that would be. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar's fine. Don't worry about this. And he's out back eating grass. And he's got long hair and stuff. And don't let him get on TV, So,
Green Jean-Pierre.
yeah, exactly. So, what a mess.
How could you spin that way?
Yeah.
Spinning, man. It's spinning.
He's spending more time in nature, trying to clear his head. Yeah.
Kind of slow learner.
Yeah.
This guy.
And so at the end of this time, he says, you're gonna experience this until you basically come to acknowledge, until it says in verse 32, you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. This is your condition. What's amazing about this is sanity returns when sovereignty is affirmed. He's like, until you affirm who I am, who I really am in my prerogatives, you're going to be insane. And once you acknowledge that, your sanity will return to you. People who know their God are sane. They're the same people. Everyone else is insane. And so he then declares this incredible statement of God's sovereign prerogative in verses 34 to the end of the chapter. It's an eternal sovereignty. It's a present sovereignty. It's an absolute sovereignty. It's a perfect sovereignty. So, incredible. So, he recognizes God's sovereignty overall. This is a pagan king who does this. This then is contrasted with another. So, God has mercy on whom he has mercy, Nebuchadnezzar, and he hardens whom he'll harden, like Belshazzar. And that's what we see in chapter 5. And chapter 5, you could call God's sovereign punishment. God's sovereign punishment. It recounts the fulfillment of Daniel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah's prophecy of the fall of Babylon. And like I said, when you take chapters 4 and 5 together, you see the patience of God and the severity of God. Patience with Nebuchadnezzar and severity with Belshazzar. And so essentially they're having this big party, and he takes some of the utensils from the temple, and he's like, oh yeah, get those things out, let's party and fill it up. And they're just drinking and enjoying it, and all of a sudden a hand appears out of nowhere and writes on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, and numbered. And the kingdom is, they've been found wanting, and in essence, their days are up. Babylon's days are up. You are done. And so, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And so, he's removed. Now, of course, I don't have time to get into this. This is way too complicated. But how do you get from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar, where there's this whole palace intrigue of one after the other to get down? But this is still the Babylonian kingdom. And so Daniel's just been surviving through this, faithfully serving. And this guy, Belshazzar, is a wicked king here. And God writes on the wall, your time is up. He punishes him. and just incredible. And I mean, they just lose their minds when they see this hand. I mean, they're terrified. You should read the text and see what it actually says. And they're just terrified. Well, that's exactly what happens. It says, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, verse 30, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So now the kingdom shifts, and so it fulfills Daniel's prophecy. So it goes from Babylon to Medo-Persia. So now we have the next kingdom in place. Chapter 6, we could maybe call God's sovereign powers or protection. And here we have Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel is shown to be faithful. Really, chapter 6 begins with an incredible miracle. A politician that has no dirt on him. And that's what Daniel is. Chapter 6 begins, and Daniel's been this career politician in Babylon, and they're like, okay, we got to get something on this guy, and they can't find anything. There's nothing on him. Get the file out. It's empty. There's nothing. Well, what does he do? Well, he's so committed to his God. And they're like, well, let's find something in that area. Because that's what they do. They make this rule so that you can't pray. And so Daniel is committed. He's just doing what he normally does. He's not doing something extraordinary. He's just doing his normal prayers. And they catch him in that. And they force the king, because he can't repeal this law, to throw him into the lion's den. And so Daniel is going to be thrown to the lions. It just is a reminder that trials in life never end. We never retire when it comes to living for God. Daniel, though now in his 80s, is still persevering in his relationship with God. He's just praying, faithful, and he's still holding fast. And it's just a sober reminder, too, that you got to make it all the way. You got to make it. Even if you're in your 80s, you still got to persevere. And trials never end. So here's another one. He's still daily pursuing the Lord, and as a result, he's forced to defy a temporary prayer mandate. And this new world government is in place, and yet living for God remains the same. And so he's dependent upon the Lord. He's faithful to the Lord, and he fears the Lord more than man. And God protects him in that. And the result is, the king is like eager to find out what happens. He doesn't want to see Daniel die. And so he comes after the night has passed. And God shuts the mouth of these lions. He's sovereign over animals, all of his creation. And so what happens to the men who set Daniel up or got him thrown in this pit? Well, they get thrown in the pit. And it says before they even hit the ground, the lions are like, wham! They didn't eat all night. And now they're starving. And so God is he's proclaimed as the great God. This is what Darius says in verse 26. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So, or it might even be that is Cyrus the Persian. There's debate. Who is Darius? He's probably Cyrus. So there's a translational issue. It might be Darius. That is the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Anyway, that's a side issue. So Daniel's preserved. Chapter 7, then, you have God's sovereign preeminence, his sovereign preeminence. And the focal point is really in chapter 7, and it gives a panorama of world history, of human history. So, chapter 7, you have, it begins with these 4 beasts that come out of the sea, lion, a bear, a leopard, and then this beast that has 4 heads. And it parallels what Daniel saw earlier in chapter 2. You got Babylon, you got Medo-Persia, you got Greece, and then you've got Rome. And the beast has, it does the same thing. You've got the second form of Rome. Let's see, verse 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. There's a reference to the feet again. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So remember we said that there's 10 toes, right, in the first one. So now he's just giving a different vision because it's almost like God's perception of these Gentile kingdoms. They're beastly, right? They're beastly, they're creaturely. And so they have 10 toes, but now it parallels this talking about the same kingdom, this final form of Rome, and now it has 10 horns. And verse 8, and I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Here we're introduced to the little horn. This guy goes by a lot of names. He's the man of lawlessness. We know him also as the Antichrist. He's the false shepherd. So you have this 10 king confederacy in the final kingdom of the world, and this one other horn pops up and grows up, and he takes down 3, and he establishes himself as prominent among the final kingdom. And so we're going to see more of him in just a moment. So you see this vista of these different kingdoms, and how God just shows his control over them and really the chronology of them, confirmed prior in chapter 2 and now confirmed here in chapter 7. And then we see God's kingdom, and we see it describing the Ancient of Days. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. That's a reference to Ezekiel with the wheels there. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open. Now look, it goes back now in verse 11 to talk about the little horn. I looked then because of the second and of the great words, I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. And as for the rest of the beast, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So here's the destruction of this little horn in the end. Paul says, he talks about the man of lawlessness coming, and then the Lord Jesus appears and he destroys him. It's like this instant kill, and effortlessly kills him. So he describes that. And then verse 13, he says, and I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. I talked about this morning a little bit, how the way Daniel sets up chapter 7 is you've got these different beasts, creatures, these kingdoms described as beasts that are coming out of the sea. And so it's a picture of creation as there's the waters covering the earth. God then brings out the land, and then he brings out the animals from the earth. And following that, you have a man who's given dominion over all of these different things. And so it's like a rehearsing of creation. So Adam failed in that, and Adam was a son of man, so to speak. Jesus is connected to that. He's a second Adam, and he's the one who will be the ultimate ruler over all the kingdoms of the world in this final kingdom. And so, once again, it matches with what we saw in chapter 2, that in the days of those kings, those 10 kings, there will be a kingdom set up that will be an eternal kingdom, the kingdom of the Messiah. And we see that confirmed here. Well, the detail we're added, though, is this little horn, this particular ruler that's going to have a prominence among this final kingdom in Rome, and how he will be killed and destroyed before the setting up of the Messiah's kingdom. So you follow that? Okay. So the rest of chapter 7, we don't really have time to read it, but it essentially talks about how this horn, this little horn of the fourth kingdom, there's a lot of details you've got to keep in place in Daniel, but this little horn of the fourth kingdom is going to persecute the saints, the people of God. And he's going to, verse 21, as I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. And the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. So he's going to have this worldwide domination. Look at verse 23. We get a little bit more. Then he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms. And so he's explaining the vision that he had earlier. And it shall devour the whole earth. So now it's not just one part. It's worldwide domination. This is a worldwide kingdom. And trample it down, break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise. So now we got 10 toes, 10 horns, which are 10 kings. So he's explaining all of the details, even though it's in symbolism. He eventually explains it. The 10 kings shall arise, and another king shall arise after them. That's the little horn that pops out. He shall be different from the former ones, and he shall put down 3 kings. That's what it said earlier. He shall speak words against the Most High, so shall and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for, listen to this, a time, times, and a half a time. So time is 1, times is 2, and a half a time is a half. So that's 3.5. So this is where we start to get Daniel giving us this 3.5 year period. So you got 3.5 on one end, 3.5 on the other. Chapter 9, he's going to tell us this total, a 7-year period, which has 2 3.5 sections. But the court will sit, verse 26, the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion, that's this little horn, the Antichrist dominion, shall be taken away to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. Now, here's what's interesting about this. There is a shift that took place that's subtle that you could have missed. In verse 14, it says that the dominion and the kingdom is given to the Son of Man. But in the interpretation of the dream, it says that the Antichrist is destroyed and the kingdom is given to the saints. And so what's interesting here is there's this connection between the Son of Man and the saints. And there's what we've talked about this so many times, this concept of corporate solidarity, that the one represents the many. And Paul picks up on this, and Paul makes this point so much that we're united to Christ, we're in union with Christ, and therefore what Christ has, we have. And so Paul will talk about, when Christ reigns, we will reign with him. And so he's making that connection even more explicit, and he gets it from Daniel, because when the king reigns, his saints reign with him. And so that's really what Daniel is setting up for, that Paul elaborates on more. So the reign of the saints coincides with the reign of the Savior. So that's what we see there in chapter 7. It's quite the overview, and it shows the preeminence of the Son of Man. He is the only one worthy to rule the kingdoms of the world. All right, that's a lot. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we shift back to Hebrew. And in this last few chapters, chapter 8 to 12, and we see God's sovereign preservation in chapter 8. And so just to summarize this chapter, what you have here from our perspective is ancient history. This has already happened for us. But from Daniel's perspective, much of what happens in chapter 8 was the distant future for him. It's the first, in this chapter, we get a glimpse of Alexander the Great, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and in a shadowy way, the Antichrist. We might put it like this. We see the big horn, the little horn, and the final horn. I like to call them the original Beastie Boys. Antiochus serves, what Daniel does here is he makes Antiochus serve as a type or a pattern of the future Antichrist. And that's important. Antiochus is the Old Testament Antichrist, if you will, that persecutes Israel. It helps Israel to prepare for that future final time, because really it shows that Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who is of the third kingdom of Greece, is going to be one of the most wicked persecutors of Israel. And yet, even in that, God will preserve Israel through it. He'll keep them through it. And it's a way to say to them, just like and he actually calls Antiochus a little horn. But if we paid attention, the little horn comes from which kingdom? 1, 2, 3, or 4? The last one, right? The fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire, the revived form. But this little horn comes from the third kingdom of Greece. So there's a parallelism here that Antiochus is a little horn that persecutes Israel, that is, you're made to make the connection that he's like the other little horn, but of a different kingdom. So there's this parallelism that just like, here's the message really that Daniel's trying to get across. Just like God preserved you in some of your worst persecution, or for them, your worst coming persecution during the Grecian Empire under this man Antiochus Epiphanes IV, God preserved you there. And you can know in the worst ever persecution that you will have under the final little horn, the Antichrist, God's going to preserve you through that as well. So don't lose heart. So that's really the message of chapter 8 as he focuses in upon these different men. It's incredible. I mean, there's so much here. It talks about a ram and a goat, and basically Medo-Persia and Greece. And he's really, what he's doing is he's expanding upon the middle two kingdoms, Medo-Persia and Greece, and showing in their more near future what's going to happen for them. And so he talks about Alexander the Great and his 4 generals. I mean, this is insanity, how specific that he is. And this is why liberal commentators on Daniel, they have to push Daniel way into like the 100s of being written, because he says so much stuff that's so accurate ahead of time that there's no way a person could know this level of detail unless God exists and God reveals his future in a book. And so it is a nightmare for people who don't believe in God and don't believe in prophecy. They have to say, well, he was just telling history after the fact and making it seem like he was prophesying it. But there is just such rock-solid evidence for an early date for Daniel that they just have it's a miracle if Daniel's written in the hundreds. This is another way to put it. I mean, Daniel, there's so many evidences of his early writing that it's just inescapable. So they got to do something with it. But he predicts Alexander, Antiochus the fourth, and what's going to happen there, and then finally how it is a precursor to the future. Okay, chapter 9 is just such a phenomenal chapter. It's 2 parts really. Daniel is praying, and he's studying Jeremiah, and he basically comes to the conclusion that God said that we would be in exile in Babylon for 70 years to be punished for not following the Sabbath years. Every 7 years you're supposed to let the land rest, and we didn't ever do that as a nation, and so God is punishing us for a year in captivity for every year we didn't do that. Every 7th year we didn't do that, and so it's this large period of time where this takes place over, and a 490-year period, essentially, where they're never following the 7th year Sabbath laws. So God sends them into a 70-year captivity. And so he realized that, and he realizes that they're almost up to 70 years. So what does he do? He starts praying, God, we repent, and bring us back, fulfill what you said in your word. And so it's this incredible prayer in chapter 9, verses 1 to 19. And the answer to the prayer is even better. Because God says, okay, this 490-year period that you were in captivity for 70 years for breaking this law for 490 years, here's what the future holds, Daniel. There's another 490-year period that is for your people. So it's not over yet. It's not even close to over yet, Daniel. But this is the spectrum of history. And here we see God's sovereignty over the panorama of history, because what he reveals is this 70-week prophecy. And essentially, what you have is it's broken into 3 sections. You have this first 7 weeks, and the 70, each of these weeks is a year, essentially. So you've got a 490-year period that he reveals. And he reveals a number of things 6 things that are going to happen within this period. They're going to be completed within this period. And so the first 7 weeks equals 49 years. And what happens during that period? Well, essentially, what happens is the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the end of Nehemiah's ministry, and the closing of the Old Testament scriptures. So that's the first 49 years. Then there's a 62-week period, which equals 434 years. And combined, they have a total of 69 weeks, which is 483 years. Based on how they reckon time, on a 360-year day, 360-day year, and 30-day months, when you calculate this out, and a number of people have done it, essentially you get from, you start it with Nehemiah 2 and the decree that goes out in that time. It's like 444, I think, or 445. And where it terminates is at the day of the triumphal entry. It's insane. This prophecy is absolutely insane. And here's really what he says here. Verse, let's see, 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, or like a Messiah, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. That's the first part. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, so what he's saying is there's this, combine them together, you have 69 weeks. It terminates at the triumphal entry. And if you look at Luke 21, he says, would that you on this day knew the things that make for peace, but now they're hidden from you. And so he walks into Jerusalem fulfilling this. And that's why there was such expectation for the Messiah during the time of Jesus, because of this prophecy. And so what happens after that expires? It says in verse 26, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. So what he's saying is there's a gap from the ending of the 69th week and some events that take place after. So he comes in the beginning of the week into the triumphal entry, and then a few days later, he's cut off. He dies later that week, Good Friday. And so this anointed one is cut off. He dies. He has nothing. And then he gives another prediction of what's going to happen. And the people of the prince who is to come, okay, now we've got to really pay attention to what we read. The prince who is to come is the little horn, the Antichrist, and he comes from the fourth kingdom, which is Rome, okay? So it's not the Antichrist he's talking about, but he says the people of the prince. Who are the people? Rome. So we might say Rome shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, when did that happen? 70 AD, yeah. So he's predicting 70 AD here, that comes after the Messiah appears and dies. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. So what's amazing about this is, and so people get hung up on, there are some different views on how to calculate the math, but no matter what, essentially everyone agrees that the Messiah had to come before 70 AD. He had to come based on this prophecy. So if you want to just push all the numbers and everything out, and you just say, who else fit the description of the Messiah pre-70 AD in this period between, let's just give it, just be generous and say between 1 AD or 4 AD and 70 AD. Who met the description of the Messiah? That's your time. Israel. There's no one else. You're not looking for someone. He already came. He had to come in this time period. And so it's just an incredible prophecy of precision. And then there's a final hanging week. And there's a gap. And it was a mystery then, but it's clearer now that where is that gap? Well, it's the church age. I mean, doesn't say it here, but clearly there's a gap because the 69 weeks expires at the triumphal, and then there's some stuff that happens after, like the death of the Messiah, and then like a few decades later, the destruction of the temple, and then you get this final week, which equals 7 years and completes the 490 years. Verse 27, and he, that is the prince who is to come, the Antichrist, shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And the many is Israel. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. So we've talked about this in Ezekiel. Israel's going to build a third temple. They're going to be, they're going to be apostate, of course. But he's going to make a covenant with them. And then he puts an end to their sacrifice and offering halfway through. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So he's essentially saying that in the 70th week, the 7-year period, whenever it starts, we don't know. Whenever it does start, one of the beginning things that will start it is this little horn who makes a covenant with Israel. And in the middle of that, he breaks his covenant and he persecutes them. And so it's like, what in the world? And this is where we get the tribulation period being 7 years long from this text. So it gives you goosebumps when you study this in detail and you're like, the Bible is that precise? It predicted the triumphal entry of Jesus? I mean, it just blows your mind. All right, I can do it. I can finish up here. So 10 and 11 do this. They essentially are, 10, 11, and 12 are one big prophecy. And here's what they do. They focus on the Persian and Greek empires. It's like chapter 8 all over again, where it's saying, hey, if God can preserve you in this kingdom, when Greece is persecuting you, he can preserve you into the future when the Antichrist comes. And what you have here is God's sovereignty in precision. Because in chapter 10 and 11, really mainly chapter 11, if the 70 weeks prophecy was, not enough for you, this is insanity in chapter 11. Because there's like 100 prophecies in chapter 11 that have already all happened, that are about kings and palace intrigue, and Cleopatra's in there. I mean, it's like all these different things that we can look at history books and go like, oh, that happened, that happened, that happened, that happened, that happened. 100 different prophecies at least in chapter 11, verses 1 to 35, that it's like a nightmare to try and figure out, but it's all there. You just got to do it. It's like doing calculus, And you see the precision that he's saying, okay, then this king will happen, and then this king will happen, then this king will happen, then this king will happen, then this king will happen throughout the Greek period. And the level of precision just blows your mind. So this is why it's the liberal's nightmare, because the precision in chapter 11, it is the ultimate confirmation of the Word of God, that it's true, that only God could have written this book because of how precise it is. I like to call it the A-team. He talks about Ahasuerus, Alexander the Great, Antiochus III, Antiochus IV, and then it shifts in verse 36, and he then zooms to the future like he did before in chapter 8, where he's saying, hey, just like Antiochus persecuted, so will the future Antichrist. And verse 36 and following moves to the future, and we see the end there. And so really, he talks about the persecution that will happen again in the end of chapter 11. And then chapter 12, we come to the end. And really we see how the same pattern that comes up over and over again in so many different books, tribulation, then rescue, then a kingdom. And that's what happens at the chapter 12, verse 1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. This is Israel's resurrection. Some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But for you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Let's make a comment here. Daniel's told, seal up the vision. So Israel's going to be persecuted, a time of trouble that's never happened before upon the whole earth, the great tribulation, and then God will deliver his people, he'll resurrect them. But he says, for now, seal up the book. Now in Revelation, John is told, don't seal up this book. And you're like, well, what's the difference? Well, for Daniel, he's still, in his location in history, he's told all these things. He says, seal up, preserve the book, because you still got Greece, you still got, you got Media Persia, you got Greece, you got Rome, and then you've got this whole period until the 70th week comes, and you've got this whole time period. It's a long way away, Daniel, so you just be faithful. But for us, when John writes Revelation, he's writing from a perspective where all those other nations have come, and he's sitting in Rome, in Roman rule, and he says, don't seal this up, because what's left, John? The only thing left in the span of the panoramic of history is the 70th week. Everything else has happened. The Messiah's come. The Messiah's been cut off. The temple has been destroyed, because John writes Revelation in like 90, 95. The only thing left in world history is the 70th week. So he says, don't seal this book up, because there's only one event left, the 70th week. And so it's like, whoa, man, the Revelation's so exciting, because like we sit in the point in history when all the other things he said in world history were going to take place. And all we're waiting for is that last 7 years. Well, we're not waiting to endure it, because we're the church and we know the promise of the rapture. So this is the incredible book of Daniel. Why should we study Daniel? Because of the sovereign reign of God, because of the specificity of predictive prophecy in it, because of the scope of God's plans for the world and the worldview it gives us, and really for the sanctified character of Daniel. I mean, this guy is just such an example of perseverance, even in difficult times. There's Daniel. Thanks for a little extra time.